The sky was dry, the land cracked beneath the sun's heat, crops had withered, wells had dried, and in a small town called Zarephath, a widow prepared herself for what she believed would be her final act. She wasn't a woman of means. She had no storehouse, no backup plan, no hidden reserve, just a handful of flour, a little oil, and a son she loved. The famine had taken everything else. As she walked through the dusty streets gathering sticks, her mind replayed the numbers. She had enough for one more meal, one last bit of bread. Then she and her son would lie down and wait for what they had been dreading, death by starvation. But before she could carry out her plan, a stranger approached. He was a man with tired eyes, weathered by travel and time, a prophet, though she didn't know it yet. His name was Elijah, and he asked her for water. She paused, perhaps surprised that a stranger would request such a precious commodity. Still, she turned to go fetch it. Then came the second request, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Now she stopped, not out of rudeness, but because the words hit a nerve. Bread? There was barely enough for her and her son. She turned back to the man and said, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." It wasn't a dramatic statement, it was her reality. And then Elijah said something remarkable. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you've said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Imagine the moment. The internal wrestle. Give away the last of what you have to a stranger. Trust a promise from a man you've never met. Risk everything on a word. It defies logic. It fights against survival instinct. And yet, that is what she did. She went home, took the flour, poured the oil, kneaded the dough, baked the bread, and gave it away first. It was the kind of obedience that's not loud or showy, but sacrificial, costly, quietly courageous. And just as Elijah said, the jar was not empty, the jug was not dry. Not that day, not the next, not for many days. The miracle wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, it was daily. God sustained her one day at a time, just enough, just in time. Before we continue, if this story is stirring something in you, if you've ever felt like you were down to your last bit of hope, your last ounce of strength, take a moment to like this podcast, share it with someone facing a dry season, leave a comment about how God has met you in unexpected ways, and subscribe for more reflections that bring life and truth to your week. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful moments from Scripture. Back to the widow. She didn't know that her simple act of faith would become a testimony retold for generations. She didn't know that her willingness to give when she had so little would unlock a season of provision. She didn't know that the God of Israel, whom she may have barely known, was watching her with tenderness and purpose. This story isn't just about Elijah's prophetic role. It's about a woman whose obedience and obscurity became the stage for a miracle. And isn't that often the way of God? He doesn't always wait for perfect conditions. He doesn't only work through the strong and the resourced. Sometimes he chooses the worn out, the overlooked, the one gathering sticks for a funeral meal, and he invites them into a greater story. Her last meal became her first miracle, not because she had abundance, but because she had trust. Faith is not measured by how much you have. It's revealed in what you do with what little remains. The widow didn't pray for a miracle. She wasn't asking for divine intervention. She was simply surviving, preparing for the end. But God saw her. God sent provision before the desperation consumed her. He sent a prophet, he sent a word, and he sent a promise that would carry her through the drought. Many of us live in fear of running out of time, of money, of energy, of love. We cling to what we have, afraid that letting go will leave us empty. But this story flips that logic. The widow gave and she received. She risked what little she had, and it opened the door to daily sustenance. It didn't come in heaps or barns full of grain. It came in the quiet consistency of just enough. And sometimes that's the miracle we need most. Not sudden abundance, but steady faithfulness. Not extravagance, but enough to keep going one more day. This isn't a story about prosperity. It's a story about provision. God provided for a widow and her son, not because she had wealth, but because she had obedience, and obedience isn't always grand. Sometimes it looks like making one small loaf of bread, even when your heart is breaking. Sometimes it's trusting that what God asks of you will not leave you empty, but full in a way you didn't expect. And it didn't end there. Sometime later, her son grew ill. He stopped breathing. And the same prophet who had come with a promise now stood with her in the shadow of death. She cried out in anguish. Elijah took the boy, carried him to the upper room, and laid him before the Lord. And once again, God answered. He restored the boy's life, 2 miracles, 1 woman, and a journey that began with a handful of flour. Because when God steps into your ordinary, he does the extraordinary. The widow's story is a reminder that your obedience today may unlock provision tomorrow. That what looks like a last meal may, in God's hands, become the beginning of a season of miracles. And perhaps that's where you find yourself right now. Empty jar, dry heart, heavy soul. You're gathering sticks, not out of hope, but because you've given up. But then God speaks. Maybe not through a prophet at your door, but through a whisper in your heart, a nudge, a calling to trust, to give, to obey. And just like that, the oil begins to flow. Not all at once, but day by day. Enough for today, and enough again tomorrow. So don't despise the small acts of faith. Don't underestimate the power of simple obedience. Don't assume that your little isn't enough for God to use, because in his hands a handful of flour can feed a family for weeks. A surrendered yes can carry you through a famine, and a widow gathering sticks can become the heroine of a divine encounter. This is the beauty of the God we serve. He meets us in scarcity. He honors our obedience. He multiplies what we surrender. And he writes stories with people who never thought they'd be included. You may feel like the least likely candidate for a miracle, but so did she. And look what God did. This is the story of the widow and the last meal. And it's a reminder to all of us. God sees, God provides, and God still multiplies the little we place in his hands. And maybe the real miracle wasn't the flour or the oil. Maybe the miracle was in the transformation of a heart, one that shifted from resignation to hope, one that went from expecting death to receiving life, a woman who was ready to say goodbye, now entrusted with sustaining a prophet, raising a resurrected child, and carrying a legacy of faith. There are days when we feel like we're down to nothing. No answers, no strength, no clarity, just survival. But that's often where God does his best work. He doesn't always swoop in with thunder and lightning. Sometimes he shows up in a quiet request. Will you trust me with what you have? And when we do, heaven responds. The story of the widow at Zarephath is not just about a historical moment. It's a reflection of how God still works. He meets us where we are. He speaks through the unexpected. He moves through the mundane, and He provides not always what we imagined, but always what we need. Maybe today God is calling you to trust Him with something small, your time, your voice, your last ounce of faith. And maybe, just maybe, on the other side of that small obedience is a flow that never runs dry. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to say yes. Because miracles often begin when we're honest about our lack and obedient with our little. And God, He is faithful to do the rest. So the next time you feel like you're at the end, remember the widow, remember the handful of flour, and remember the God who turned her last into a beginning. He can do the same for you. Thank you for listening. You might never see your name in a headline or feel like a central figure in any grand story. But to God, you are never invisible. He sees your empty jar, your aching heart, your quiet endurance. He sees when you give even when it hurts. He sees when you love even when you're tired. He sees when you keep showing up even when there's nothing left to pour. That kind of faith does not go unnoticed in heaven. God doesn't measure by the size of the offering, but by the depth of the surrender. And what He can do with a surrendered heart is greater than anything we can imagine. So today, as you face whatever is ahead, whether it feels like abundance or scarcity, strength or weariness, remember this: the God of the widow is still your God. He still multiplies, He still restores, He still sees, and He is still writing stories with people who choose trust over fear, obedience over self-preservation, and faith over finality. Your last may not be your end. In God's hands, it just might be your beginning.